Hello, this Science of Sport video working on the BTEC Sport and Exercise Sciences course, and in particular looking at the Unit 2 Functional Anatomy. So this video is part of a series of videos on the muscular system, and in particular looks at E1 muscle types. Now there are a couple of sections to this muscle types learning aim, and this one is part 1, which is on the 3 different types of muscle tissue. So, in terms of those 3 different types of muscle tissue, then you may recognize some of these names or terms, but we have cardiac, smooth, and skeletal muscle tissue. Now, visually, this is the sort of overview of where these 3 different types of muscle tissue might be found. So, let's start in the middle actually with cardiac muscle tissue. You should hopefully recognise that that is the heart, which is a muscular organ, and this is a very special kind of muscle tissue that is only found in the wall of the heart. We'll look at that in more detail in a moment. So next we have smooth muscle tissue. Now it's labelled as smooth because it's not striped or striated, unlike cardiac and skeletal muscle tissue, and it's mainly found in the tubes of our body, so our internal tubes, like our blood vessels, like our digestive system tubes. Lastly, we've got skeletal muscle tissue, which is what makes up our muscle fibers, and our muscle fibers make up our muscles. So this type of tissue is only found on the sort of more superficial area of our body, the muscles that are on our skeleton and help us to assume different sporting body positions and move, of course. So we're going to look at each of those 3 types of muscle tissue in much more detail. And what I've done is I've divided the detail down into structural characteristics and functional characteristics. Remember that a lot of, in fact, most anatomy that you'll study tries to connect how something is built or structured to how it functions or the job it's got to do. So let's look at the detail of cardiac muscle tissue. Cardiac muscle tissue is only found in the wall of the heart. Remember, the heart is a muscular organ. Its job, as you hopefully know, is to pump or eject blood out around the body or up to the lungs. So it needs to be able to contract to force the blood out of it. And it's this muscular wall, which actually has a special name called the myocardium. So the myocardium is the muscular wall of the heart, and it is made of these types of cardiac muscle tissue, and they're very special. They're generally quite tiny and quite thin individually, and notably they work involuntarily or not under conscious control. You do not sort of consciously instruct your heart to contract. It does it for you, so it is an unconscious action. And all our unconscious actions are controlled by what we call the autonomic nervous system, or ANS is often how I abbreviate it. So you've got a special nervous system that gives instructions to things like your heart muscles to make them work, and you don't actively give those instructions. It happens beyond your awareness. The other thing that can affect the heart muscle or myocardium contracting is our endocrine system. So that's things like hormones, and you may know of a hormone called adrenaline, which can have an impact on how fast our heart contracts or how quickly the myocardium contracts. So we've got very specialized tissue only found in the wall of the heart. It's called the myocardium. It works involuntarily or not under conscious control. It's controlled by autonomic nervous system, so nerves making it contract, or hormones like adrenaline. And in actual fact, you may have heard of a pacemaker that sometimes we have artificially put in bodies to help people's hearts work if they have any kind of illness or sort of defect. Now, our heart's pacemaker is actually called the sinoatrial node. Later in this unit, we'll learn about that in more detail. So the sinoatrial node is our heart's natural pacemaker. It coordinates the contraction of the heart chambers, and it determines and sends out impulses through the myocardium to make the chambers contract. Now, again, the cardiac fibers, if you looked under a microscope, you should be able to see slightly over here, it's not the best diagram for it, that there is some stripes to it. So under a microscope, cardiac tissue looks striped, and that's because it has different types or components to its fibers. Makes it look stripy. Striated or stripy kind of means the same thing. And also the fibers are interconnected or intercalated. So you don't just have one long fiber, you have a fiber that branches off and connects to another fiber, which branches off and connects to another fiber. So they're all interrelated. And what that does is it helps the spread of the impulse through the cardiac fibers happen very quickly. So structurally, that's our description. That's a lot of the information you might need to know. And this is the function. So we know cardiac muscle tissue needs to contract regularly, repeatedly, without getting tired. And we know that at rest, our heart contracts, approximately 60 to 80 beats per minute. Textbooks often say 72 beats per minute. But with a bit of luck, our heart muscle, our myocardium, does not tire because these fibers are designed to not tire, not fatigue. They work continuously. As long as they have oxygen, that's a really important point actually that's not on this slide. As long as they have oxygen, they can go on indefinitely. Next then, let's look at smooth muscle tissue. Now hopefully you remember that this is the sort of muscle tissue which is in and around the walls of the tubes of our body, inside our body. So good examples to remember are blood vessels. So blood vessels like arterioles, veins, arteries have smooth muscle wrapped around them, and they have particular roles, and there's a reason why they're there. So they're found in the walls of most tubes, visceral organs. They're smaller than skeletal muscle fibers in terms of comparison, and again, similar to the cardiac muscle tissues, they work automatically for us. They are involuntary. You do not consciously make them contract. This happens automatically for us. And again, this automatic control comes from instructions from our autonomic nervous system. So perhaps a way of remembering the autonomic nervous system is the fact that it's automatic. Make the connection between those words. So in terms of the functions of this smooth muscle tissue, it kind of depends a little bit on the tubes that we're talking about. So our digestive tubes, for example, typically the function is to push fluid and food and solid along the digestive tracts. In terms of, or perhaps in terms of the veins, so we have smooth muscle tissue around our larger veins, it's to help squeeze blood back up against gravity to get it back to the heart. So it aids venous return, a bit like you might squeeze a toothpaste tube to get some toothpaste out. Arterioles, for example, have smooth muscle tissue around them, and they are another type of blood vessel, and they can get narrower, they can constrict, or they can relax and get wider, and that either helps control blood flow, where blood can and can't go, or can help moderate blood pressure. So if blood pressure goes up, these vessels might relax and widen the tubes, the blood vessels, and our blood pressure hopefully will go down. So the smooth muscle tissue, good examples are the digestive tubes, the digestive tract, and also blood vessels. So lastly then, our third type of muscle tissue are skeletal muscles or skeletal muscle tissue. Now this is different from the other two types in that we can consciously control the contraction of our skeletal muscle fibers. We can get them to work voluntarily. So we would send an impulse from our brain, our central nervous system, down our spinal cord, and then along nerves, peripheral nerves, which would be our peripheral nervous system, to the muscle, and basically sending an instruction and making it contract. So it's in contrast to the other two tissues, this is the only type of muscle tissue which we can consciously or voluntarily control. Now, our muscles as a whole are made up of lots of bundles of individual muscle fibers. So a skeletal muscle fiber is just one strand, and we have loads of fibers that make up our muscles, depending on, of course, the size of the muscle themselves. And the muscle as a whole is broken down, as I said, into bundles and different layers. So we've got endo, peri, and epimysiums. So different layers, which we'll look at again when we look at muscle anatomy. So the job of these muscles, or this type of muscle tissue, is often to make movement happen. So muscles are attached above and below a joint or either side of a joint. When the muscle contracts, it pulls on the bone and can make a limb or a part of our body move. Other muscles are constantly contracting a little bit and help us maintain certain postures. So often, sat at your table, sat on the sofa, you're supposed to sit up straight, and it's postural muscles that are contracting to enable us to keep that certain position. Muscles also have store energy for us. So carbohydrate stored in our muscles is called muscle glycogen. And you may know that on a cold day, you go outside and we start to shiver, and that's basically our skeletal muscles involuntarily contracting, because when they contract, they generate heat. The other big difference that skeletal muscle tissue has from the other two types of muscle tissue is that it can fatigue. Smooth and cardiac tissue does not tend to fatigue, whereas skeletal muscle tissue and muscles and muscle fiber does fatigue. You know, if you've worked really hard in your particular sport, then your muscles feel tired. They can't sustain that level of performance. So what I suggest you do is you learn these characteristics. You can see I've tried to summarize in a very simplified way the detail of the three types of muscle tissue, and I've based it on these specific criteria or characteristics. So if you can learn what's the function and then go across effectively and know each of the different types of tissue functions, where do you find it, the wall of the heart, the myocardium, etc., etc. This might be a way of prompting you to recall the different information for the three different types of muscle fiber. So my advice to you would be to learn these characteristics or these criteria, and then from that, hopefully you'd be able to remember what the answer was to each of the three types of muscle tissue.